Matthews was the number one. He would have ruled the United States.
He's literally fallen off the face of the earth.
A lot of people looked up to Frank for probably all the wrong reasons.
In my opinion, Frank Matthews was a much larger drug dealer than Frank Lucas.
In 1971, Frank Matthews first came on the police radar, but only by luck.
Well, it was rather peculiar. Had a report from some precinct that there was some unusual going on in an apartment building in Brooklyn.
This was going on, and Kowalski comes along. He was living at 130 Clarkson Avenue in Brooklyn, which, incredibly, could you imagine this, was the same building, apartment building, that Frank Matthews was living in.
Well, this guy is complaining that there's all the parking places around his house on the weekends are all taken up by out-of-state cars, all going into one apartment.
And he started doing some investigating. And he saw that a lot of these guys were big-time drug dealers that had charges against them or were being investigated, coming from all over the East Coast and from the Midwest. And this was about 1970 it began. About 18 months or so later, he presented it to his superiors. And that's when the investigation began.
Special Agent Jerry Miller and Detective Roger Garay came to our office to break some bread with us and talk about a case they had called the Frank Matthews case.
Once they got the wiretaps up on Matthews' phones, the feds quickly realized just how big of a fish they had caught in their net.
They had a wiretap going, and I heard enough to know that we're not dealing here with an ordinary Brooklyn-based drug operation. It's very huge.
Nobody knew about this. I mean, you know, he was developing his network. He wasn't even on the radar. They had no investigation going. He was making millions of dollars a year. And if it wasn't for one cop named Joe Kowalski, that investigation might have not have started for another 10 years.
DEA quickly realized Matthews was setting up 100-kilo deals down in Venezuela with the French connection, which would have made him one of the biggest heroin dealers in the country already at that point.
We got calls with unbelievable people, which I won't discuss that.
The DEA office in Greensboro that I worked very closely with at the time got a phone call from a pharmacist, I believe, in Roxborough, North Carolina, reported to them that a black male wanted to purchase, I think, a 55-gallon drum of mannitol, which is a cutting agent. That's when his name first came to my attention.
So a federal team was formed consisting of DEA, IRS, and federal prosecutors to go after Matthews.
Much like what happened with the prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s, that gave birth to what we now know as organized crime in this country, the so-called mafia. In the 1960s, there became a huge demand for drugs in this country. That gave rise to a new kind of organized crime, what I call drug kingpins or drug lords.
When Frank arrived in New York, probably in 66 or 67, the city and the whole country was really going crazy. Crime had doubled in a few years. You had the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, and drugs. In 1959, there was about 100,000 heroin addicts in the country. By 69, there was over 1 million, and most of them were in the New York area.
It became almost like a perfect storm. And I was thrown right in the middle of that in 1971. I had a front row seat to what was really going on in the drug game.
In 70, 71, heroin was endemic. Entire blocks in Brooklyn, the entire apartment houses were addicted, and small $10 packages of heroin was being used, and President Nixon was furious.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
The President called all of us down to the White House for a meeting on his drug abuse plan. He was livid with rage when I told him what was going on in Brooklyn.
We had a heroin problem in the country and definitely in New York City. And heroin addicts created violence against innocent civilians.
They come from Staten Island, New Jersey, Long Island, Connecticut.
When you think about New York City in the 70s, I mean, you looked over your shoulder 3 or 4 times before you got to the train station or your car. I mean, it was a gangster town. You know, nobody wanted to go to New York City. The politicians made a lot of noise. The media focused on that, which forced law enforcement to go after those guys that were dealing heroin.
And of course, you couldn't have all that crime without police corruption.
Some former pushers say police were more interested in getting their heroin than arresting them.
On one occasion, I was dealing drugs, and they came and took all my drugs and just let me go. Who's they? The police.
6 weeks ago in Harlem, Black Panthers seized large quantities of heroin from drug peddlers and poured it into the street. They refused to turn it over to police because they insisted police would only resell it to the pushers.
It still took a little while before he was taken seriously. Let's face it, they couldn't believe that this black guy, was working in 21 states, with this huge network, and people were coming from all over the country to buy dope from him.
In the 70s, the advent of civil rights, when African Americans were becoming more prominent in business, the drug dealers wanted to do the same thing.
A study was done in the mid-60s on a single black and Spanish Harlem. They found that 33% of the population was addicted to heroin. 1/3 of all the men, women, and children.
And Frank Matthews at that time, I think, was probably under 30 years old, was extremely bright, had good leadership skills, and had convened a meeting of all of the top African American and Hispanic drug dealers in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1971.
And I assume that this meant that he had finally gotten confident that he had locked in his contacts with the French connection down in Venezuela, and he was really ready to roll.
And his goal was to unite and form a family where they cut out the Italian mafia and went right to the source of heroin and brought it in and controlled the distribution.
Miami, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, similar information was coming back. Some guy named Matthews was behind the local organizations in those cities.
And he had been identified as one of the largest, if not the largest, heroin trafficker in the United States.
There's been a lot of recent movies on Lucas being the king of drugs. That's not true. And Matthews was the #1 heroin pioneer.
Nicky Bonds and all them, they were not, they couldn't touch Frank. I don't know why they built him up like that. Nicky Bonds was supplying New York. Frank was supplying about 25 states.
Had he not been, his wings not been clipped in '72, he would have ruled the United States.
In my opinion, Frank Matthews was a much larger drug dealer than Frank Lucas.
So here you have a black guy meeting a Cuban through a Puerto Rican to get heroin from French gangsters. The United Nations of crime.
Black power was for equality for African Americans. Black gangsters are committing illegal crimes. They're destroying the community, okay? So, as they say in the street, you don't want to get this thing twisted.
Even though the U.S. economy was booming in the late 60s, the inner cities were dying. Just as the black population started coming up to the north en masse, the industrial jobs started declining. By the early 60s, heroin is getting popular in places like Harlem, Baltimore, Detroit.
And then around 1964, 65, it was really growing. It was booming like.
A river of money is flowing because business is so good.
Put this together with the big pool of unemployed black males that are in the streets of the cities, and you have the birth of a new industry. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people standing on the corner selling drugs. And that's the world that Frank Matthews took over.
My name is Clinton Shorty Buse. I was born and I'm a native of Baltimore, Maryland. It was a poor community. We lived in poor housing. From that poor housing, we went to poor schools, received a poor education. It returned us right back into the poor community.
I grew up on a small tobacco farm in eastern North Carolina, not far from where Frank lived. And I actually grew up in sort of similar circumstances. My father was a sharecropper.
In 1959, I went to New York as a gambler. See, I used to gamble, play craps cards. I was what you call a Solomon.
I had a lot of sympathy for them. A lot of them were extremely intelligent,
we didn't have many choices. So if you don't have a choice, you have to take a chance.
They could not make money in the real world. They were not given the education opportunities that the whites had.
So a lot of us took to what was available for us, you know, gambling, trying to pimp women, drug dealing.
I needed money. I like nice clothes, pretty women. They paid you, what, $1.55 an hour. And the only other way I knew to earn that type of money was in narcotics.